Question came into me. How do you decide on what type of chipping method to apply to a model? I've talked in several videos quite a bit about picking the color, and I've talked about the types of chipping that I typically use. There's a lot of ways of doing chipping, but the different ways. How do you do the chipping? But somebody asked me, how do you decide which method to pick for your chipping? Now, as with anything, I say this a lot, as with anything in the hobby, experience is going to really drive that decision, because there's several factors that go into it. Some are better suited for speed. Some are better suited for precision. Some are better suited for light chipping. Some are better suited for heavy chipping. There's all sorts of different things, but what I basically do is early on I start thinking about. I talked about before planning a build out. Early on I think about what do I want to do at each stage of the build, so that I can plan ahead of time. For example, if you want to take advantage of some kind of hairspray chipping or chipping medium or something like that to do your chipping, you have to start planning for that long before you actually get to a point and go, now what do I want to do about chipping? Because you really need to be thinking about that, in the assembly stage, so that you can take steps in terms of sub-assemblies to allow you to get to certain portions of the model easily. You also have to think about your goal with chipping. Now, while you can do lighter chipping with, say, some kind of chipping fluid or something like that, there tends to be a little less control, so you have to factor that in. And then I also factor in knowing the weakness of various methods. So, like with hairspray chipping, I know that it's going to be there's going to be less control. Even, I heard guys say, "Oh, no, if you do it enough." If I remember early on, I asked a question about hairspray chipping. How do you really control that? And someone said, "Well, once you've become an experienced modeler, you won't have any trouble controlling the chipping." And no, hairspray chipping sometimes does what it wants. So you have to factor that in. What I generally tend to do is think more about the speed of the chipping. So if I'm really wanting to get something done, I think a sponge is the fastest way to go to get down the bulk of your chipping, and then do some adjustment with a brush. Now, it can be the same way with hairspray chipping. If you factor that in, you can use your hairspray chipping to either do the very small stuff, just very edge stuff, very random stuff, keeping it light, and then using a sponge or a brush to build up from there. Or you can use it for the very heavy chipping in only a few places, and then use the sponge or the brush or both for lighter stuff. But for me, the drive tends to be speed rather than accuracy, because of the nature of trying to get this done for video. If you've ever watched Martin Kovach's videos, I remember there was one tank that seems like he said he spent like 70 hours chipping it, because he did it with a brush, and it was a very large tank, and he wanted it to be very precise, very petite, very in scale. So he traded off that speed for a lot of time. Now, I noticed after that he started tending to use either hairspray chipping or a sponge a lot more. I think the amount of time he spent on that was, it looked great, but 70 hours is a lot of time spent on chipping a model. So factoring those things in is what I do. Now, another thing with regards to chipping, I was talking with somebody yesterday, and they'd sent me a picture. They were trying chipping. I don't remember if it was for the first time or if it was the first time they were trying brush chipping. But it looked good. Their pattern and their placement was good. It was a little heavy, in my opinion, But thankfully, we have the relationship that I could say your placement, your color, your density, your distribution, all that looks good. It's a little heavy. And what I recommended was that he switch to a liner brush for the chipping. And let me talk a little bit about why a liner brush. And let me bring in this. This is a size 2 brush. And you know all about sizes now because we talked about that in the last vlog. But while you may have a very fine tip on, say, this number 2 brush, the belly in it is going to hold a lot of paint, and there's going to be more paint flowing from it, especially if you've got your paint thinned down a little more. So a regular round brush may be a little too much for doing brush chipping. Now, you can move down in the round to a very small brush like this 3-0. That's what Martin Kovacs uses. But if you watch when he does it, he has to put some acrylic paint retarder into his paint, and he has to put a little on, go back to the palette, put a little on, go back to the palette. There's a lot of back and forth when it comes to putting on chips with a brush. I really favor using a liner brush because it kind of hits between the two, because I've got more bristle length like I would with a larger round brush, but I have a very fine point like I would with a smaller 2-0 or 3-0 brush. This is a 2-0 Blick Masterclass. It's a synthetic brush. It's become my favorite liner brush for really precise work. It's got the small tip. The belly holds a little more paint because of the length of the bristle, but it's not as much as this, so there's not as much that's going to flow off. And you're going to be able to get in and do very precise chipping that's going to be more controlled and allow you to get it more in scale. Now, there's still the factor of experience that has to come into play here, because you really have to just touch just the very tip of it. And generally, when I paint with a liner brush, when I'm doing chipping, I don't do it straight on like that. I do it at an angle. And then if you've ever watched Bob Ross, sometimes he'll say it's just 2 hairs and some air. You just barely touch it along there. Just let it just make the most bare touch to the model. And then as you move it along, that's going to draw paint off of the brush. And because of the size and the shape of this liner brush, I feel like it deposits paint in a better way than this one does, because you're not getting as much. But because the belly's longer, you can get better chipping than you could with this really short one here when you're trying to make scratches and things like that. And because there's more paint in the belly, then the paint won't dry up as fast. It stays moist longer. Now, there's also factors involved of how thin your paint is, what you thin it with, all of that stuff. If you put in a little bit of glaze medium or some retarder, it's going to stay moist for longer, and you won't have to worry as much about it drying on the brush. If you thin it with water, it's going to dry a little faster. There's a lot of factors that go into that also. But those are things to think about when you're picking your chipping method. Like I said, my favorite is use a sponge to get the heavier chipping on, and then go in and refine it with a brush. Every now and then, if you see me using some kind of chipping medium or hairspray or something like that, 9 times out of 10, I'm going to be doing it to demonstrate the technique, not because it's the simplest thing. And I know that there are modelers who are known for their hairspray chipping, and that's fine. I'm not saying don't use it. I just feel like for my work and my purposes, it's less practical than either one of these, because these are much quicker methods, and I feel like I have a much greater degree of control, especially when it comes to brush chipping. Now, a final thing to talk about, and the reason I've got this model, if you're wondering why this is sitting here, I'm fixing to start a video where I'm going to be chipping this model, and that's why I'm thinking about this. Another factor to think about when you're deciding the method that you're going to be using, whether it's going to be hairspray, whether it's going to be a sponge or a brush, is think about the amount of chipping that you want on the model and the density and distribution of it. Because there's a very big difference between if you want a lot of heavy chipping around the edges, big chunks of chips off of it, or if you want a lot of chipping, but none of them are going to be relatively any bigger than maybe a couple of fingers in size. So, if you're wanting some really heavy chipping, then hairspray chipping might work well. Although on this model, because it's so small, that may not be something that would be helpful. But think about the density and the distribution and the size of the parts that you're going to be working on, and that's going to help you also determine the method. If it's a much bigger model and you're wanting much bigger, more dramatic chipping, then the hairspray chipping and the fluids may work really well for that. If it's a big model but you're wanting ease of use and speed and things like that, the sponge is going to be your buddy. If you're wanting something to be more petite chipping but with a very high density and distribution, the sponge may be good, but a lighter touch will be required there. And then you go in and do some bigger stuff with a brush. If you're just wanting a very light density, a very, very light distribution or something like that, the brush may be the best thing there. So factor in the density and the distribution and the size of the surfaces you're working on and the scale that you're working on when you're picking any kind of chipping method and which one you think is going to work best for your model.